Welcome back to Sir Ravenclaw. Tonight we venture into the mist-shrouded hollows and forgotten corners of Appalachia, where ancient legends still whisper through the mountain winds. These 9 haunting tales from small towns reveal secrets that some families have kept buried for generations. Make sure to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. Now, let's begin our journey into the heart of Appalachian darkness. Story 1. Sarah Chen had spent 3 years studying Appalachian culture, but nothing had prepared her for the isolation of Hancock County, Tennessee. Her GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, leaving her to navigate winding mountain roads with nothing but hand-drawn directions from her advisor. The small community she sought existed in the kind of hollow that maps forgot, where families with names like Goins and Collins had lived for centuries, their origins shrouded in mystery and whispered speculation. The Melungeon people fascinated Sarah. Neither fully white nor black nor Native American, they occupied a unique space in Appalachian history. Her dissertation focused on their oral traditions, particularly the stories passed down through generations about their ancestors' supernatural abilities. What she hadn't expected was to encounter those abilities firsthand. Old Martha Goins sat on her porch, like she'd been waiting for Sarah's arrival. The woman appeared ancient, her skin the color of weathered leather, her eyes sharp as winter morning frost. When Sarah introduced herself and explained her research, Martha simply nodded and said, "I've been expecting you, child. Saw you coming in my dreams 3 nights running." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She'd heard about Melungeon prophetic gifts, but experiencing them was different entirely. Martha's gaze seemed to pierce straight through her, reading something written in a language Sarah couldn't understand. "You want to know about the old ways," Martha continued, rocking slowly in her chair. "About the gift some of us carry. Sit down, child. I got things to tell you, things you need to hear before your time comes." The word time hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah took out her recording equipment, but Martha shook her head firmly. "This ain't for your machine. This is between you and me and the knowing that runs in my blood." Martha began speaking about her great-grandmother, who could see death approaching people like a shadow falling across their path. She described how the gift worked, how it felt like ice water in her veins when the visions came. Sarah listened, transfixed, as Martha painted pictures of premonitions that had saved lives and revealed truths that law enforcement couldn't uncover. Then Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. 3 days from now, Tuesday evening, right around sunset, you'll be driving that little blue car of yours down Route 11. There's going to be a semi-truck. Driver's had too much coffee and not enough sleep. He's going to drift into your lane right at that sharp curve by Miller's Creek Bridge. Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you got a choice to make, child. You can listen to an old woman's nonsense, or you can pay attention to what I'm telling you. That truck driver, he's got brown hair going grey at the temples, wearing a red flannel shirt. His name's carved in the leather on his steering wheel, Danny Morrison from Louisville." The specificity of the details made Sarah's hands shake. This wasn't vague fortune-telling. Martha was describing a scene with photographic clarity. "How can you possibly know all that?" Martha's eyes grew distant. "Same way I know you got a scar on your left shoulder from when you fell off your bicycle when you were 7. Same way I know you're wearing your grandmother's ring on a chain around your neck, tucked under that shirt where nobody can see it." Sarah instinctively touched her chest, feeling the familiar weight of the ring beneath her blouse. She'd never mentioned her grandmother to anyone in Tennessee. Hell, she'd never told anyone about the bicycle accident. The scar was barely visible, hidden under her shirt sleeve. "The gift don't lie, child. It ain't always clear what we're seeing, but when it comes sharp and true like this, you better listen. Don't be on Route 11 Tuesday evening. Take the long way home, or better yet, stay put till Wednesday." That night, Sarah lay awake in her motel room, Martha's words echoing in her mind. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as elaborate cold reading, but the specific details nagged at her. How could Martha have known about the ring, about the scar, about things that had no logical explanation? Tuesday morning brought news that shook her to her core. The local radio reported a fatal accident on Route 11 near Miller's Creek Bridge. A semi-truck had drifted into oncoming traffic, killing the driver of a small sedan. The truck driver, identified as Danny Morrison from Louisville, survived with minor injuries. He told investigators he'd been driving too long, had dozed off at the wheel. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized that without Martha's warning, she would have been on that road at exactly that time. She would have been the victim in that car. Tuesday evening, she drove to Martha's house with questions burning in her throat, but found the porch empty. A neighbor informed her that Martha Goins had passed away peacefully in her sleep Monday night, just hours after their conversation. Funny thing, the neighbor added. She told her granddaughter she'd finished her last important task, said she could rest easy now. Standing on that empty porch, Sarah understood that Martha's final gift had been saving her life. The old woman had seen her death approaching and used her last breath of strength to change the course of fate itself. As Sarah drove away from that forgotten hollow, she carried with her not just research material, but the weight of a debt that could never be repaid. The Melungeon gift was real, and it had reached across the veil of death to offer her tomorrow. Story 2. Jake Morrison adjusted his federal badge one more time as his Model A Ford bounced along the rutted mountain road. October 1932 had been a profitable month for revenue agents in West Virginia, but this tip felt different. The informant claimed the Hawkins brothers were running the biggest still operation in 3 counties, tucked deep in a hollow that locals called Devil's Kitchen. What bothered Jake wasn't the isolation or the reputation for violence that surrounded moonshine operations. It was the way the informant had described the place, his voice dropping to a whisper when he mentioned that folks said the Hawkins boys had been dead for near on 5 years now. Jake had laughed it off as mountain superstition, but as his car climbed higher into the mist-shrouded peaks, he found himself thinking about those words. Dead men don't run stills, he told himself. Dead men don't make money selling white lightning to thirsty customers down in Charleston. The hollow opened up before him like a wound in the earth, steep walls rising on both sides, creating a natural bowl that held shadows even in daylight. Jake could smell it before he saw it, that distinctive sweet-sour scent of fermenting corn mash that meant business was good. Smoke drifted up from somewhere deeper in the trees, confirming what his nose already knew. He parked his car behind a stand of birch trees and continued on foot, following the smell and the faint sound of running water. Every good still needed a creek, and Jake had learned to follow the water to find his quarry. What he found, however, defied everything he thought he knew about bootlegging operations. The still was massive, easily the largest Jake had encountered in his 4 years with the Bureau. Copper pipes gleamed like new money, steam rose from multiple boilers, and mason jars filled with clear liquid-lined makeshift shelves. But there was something wrong with the picture, something that made his skin crawl with unease. Everything was too perfect, too clean, too organized. Most moonshine operations were rough affairs, cobbled together with salvaged parts and held together with hope and baling wire. This looked like a distillery that belonged in Kentucky, not hidden in a West Virginia hollow. Then Jake saw the men tending the operation, and his blood turned to ice water. The Hawkins brothers moved with mechanical precision, their faces pale as winter sky, their eyes fixed and staring. They went about their work without speaking, without acknowledging his presence even though Jake stood less than 20 yards away in plain sight. When one brother walked past him to adjust a valve, Jake caught a whiff of something that made his stomach lurch, a smell like meat left too long in summer heat. "Evening, boys," Jake called out, his voice echoing strangely in the hollow. "Federal agent, I'm here about your operation." Neither brother looked up. They continued their work as if Jake simply didn't exist, filling jars with practiced efficiency, checking temperatures with dead, milky eyes that never seemed to blink. Jake drew his service revolver, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his trembling hand. "I said, federal agent, you're under arrest for violating the Volstead Act." This time the older brother turned slowly, mechanically, like a wind-up toy running down. When he smiled, Jake saw teeth stained black with decay, gums the color of old blood. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind through a cemetery. "You want to try the product, Agent Man? Been cooking this batch special, just for visitors like you." The brother held out a mason jar filled with liquid so clear it seemed to bend light around it. Despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Jake found himself drawn to the offer. The jar felt cold against his palm, colder than the October air should allow. "Go on," the brother wheezed. "One taste won't hurt." Been perfecting this recipe for years now. Since we died, we got all the time in the world to get it right." Jake's rational mind rebelled against the words, but his body seemed to move without his permission. He raised the jar to his lips and took a sip that burned like liquid fire going down. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The hollow around him shifted and wavered like heat mirages. He saw the place as it truly was, saw the Hawkins brothers as they truly were. Their bodies bore the wounds that had killed them, bullet holes that still weeped black blood, faces grey with death and corruption. The still operation flickered between reality and nightmare, sometimes appearing as the pristine distillery he'd first seen, sometimes revealing itself as rusted pipes and rotting wood held together by malevolent will. Jake tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The moonshine coursed through his veins like poison, binding him to the hollow with invisible chains. He understood now why no federal agents had ever successfully raided this operation. They hadn't failed to find it. They'd found it and never left. "You're one of us now," the younger brother said, his voice emanating from a throat pierced by an axe blade that never stopped bleeding. "Bound to this place by what you drank. We got work to do and we need living hands to help us." Jake watched in horror as his own hands began moving without his permission, filling jars with the cursed moonshine, tending fires that burned with unnatural flame. He tried to scream, tried to call for help, but his voice had become as hollow and lifeless as his new companions. Years later, when other federal agents went missing in these mountains, locals would whisper about Devil's Kitchen and the moonshine operation that never got raided. They'd warn about the hollow where dead men made liquor that trapped souls, where the Hawkins brothers continued their work with help from visitors who stayed too long and drank too deep. Jake Morrison's Model A. Ford was found weeks later, abandoned on a mountain road with no sign of its driver. His badge was discovered years later by hikers, tarnished and bent, lying at the bottom of a creek that ran red with something that wasn't quite water. In Devil's Kitchen, the work continues, and the product is always perfect, distilled with the patience that only the dead possess. Story 3. Marcus Webb had lived in Pikeville his entire 16 years, and like every kid in town, he'd grown up hearing stories about the covered bridge on Old Mill Road. The locals called it the Widow's Bridge, though nobody seemed to remember exactly why. What everyone did remember were the rules: don't cross it alone after dark, don't linger on it during a full moon, and never, ever spend the night there. On Halloween night, fueled by teenage bravado and cheap beer stolen from his uncle's garage, Marcus decided those rules were nothing but small-town superstition designed to scare kids. His friends had dared him to spend the entire night on the bridge, and Marcus Webb had never backed down from a dare in his life. The covered bridge stretched across Miller's Creek like a wooden tunnel frozen in time. Built in 1847, it had weathered over a century of Kentucky seasons. Its red paint now faded to the color of dried blood. Local historians claimed it was one of the finest examples of Burr Truss construction in the state, but Marcus only cared that it was supposedly haunted by the spirit of a woman who'd died there decades ago. Marcus arrived just after midnight, armed with a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having encountered anything truly frightening. The bridge creaked ominously as he walked across its weathered planks, but he attributed that to age and wind. He set up his sleeping bag in the center of the span, where the sound of water flowing beneath created a constant, soothing murmur. For the first hour, nothing happened. Marcus lay on his back, looking up at the moon through gaps in the roof, feeling increasingly foolish about the whole endeavor. Maybe the stories were just stories after all. Maybe he'd spend a boring night on a drafty bridge and have bragging rights come Monday morning. Then he heard the music. It started as a whisper of melody, so faint he thought it might be wind through the bridge's latticed sides. But as he listened more carefully, Marcus realized it was wedding music, the kind of traditional hymns played on an old pump organ. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the bridge's walls in a way that made his skin crawl. Marcus sat up, his heart beginning to pound. The music grew clearer, more distinct, and he could swear he heard voices singing along, a small congregation celebrating a joyous occasion. But there was something wrong with the celebration, something discordant and twisted that made the hair on his arms stand on end. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The music stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of water and his own rapid breathing. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the bridge's interior, but found nothing except weathered wood and dancing shadows. He was alone, just as he'd been when he arrived. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes before the music returned, this time accompanied by footsteps. Someone was walking across the bridge from the eastern end, their heels clicking against the wooden planks in rhythm with the wedding march. Marcus aimed his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing except empty space where the footsteps should be. "This isn't funny," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "I know someone's messing with me." The footsteps stopped directly in front of him. Marcus could feel a presence there, something cold and angry that made the air around him thick and hard to breathe. When she finally appeared, it happened so gradually that Marcus wasn't sure when she became visible. One moment he was staring at empty air, and the next, a woman in a tattered wedding dress stood before him. She was beautiful and terrible, her face pale as moonlight, her dark hair pinned with wilted flowers that might have been white once but had turned the color of old blood. Her wedding dress, which had probably been magnificent on her special day, now hung in rotting tatters, stained with mud and something darker. But it was her eyes that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins, eyes filled with such rage and pain that looking into them felt like staring into an open grave. "You know who killed me," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of unresolved anger. "Your family knows. The Webbs have always known." Marcus scrambled backward, his sleeping bag tangling around his legs. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about you." The woman stepped closer, and Marcus could smell her now, the scent of decay and stagnant water that clung to things too long buried. "My name was Catherine Morrison. I was supposed to marry Thomas Webb on October 31st, 1953, your grandfather's brother. Instead, I died on this bridge, alone and afraid." The name Thomas Webb hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers about his great-uncle Thomas, the brother his grandfather never talked about, the family member whose name brought uncomfortable silences to family gatherings. Marcus had always assumed Thomas had died young in Korea, or some other tragedy the family preferred not to discuss. "Thomas Webb killed me," Catherine continued, her voice rising with each word. "Killed me because I found out about the other woman, because I threatened to tell the whole town what kind of man he really was. He pushed me from this bridge into the creek below, then told everyone I'd run away rather than marry him." Marcus tried to stand, to run, but found his legs wouldn't support him. The bridge itself seemed to have changed around him, the exits at both ends fading into impenetrable darkness. He was trapped with the vengeful spirit of a woman murdered by his own blood. "That's not true," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. "My family wouldn't do something like that." Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your grandfather knew, helped cover it up. The whole family knew, and they all kept quiet. 70 years I've been waiting on this bridge, waiting for someone from the Webb family to come close enough to hear the truth." The temperature on the bridge plummeted, and Marcus could see his breath misting in the sudden cold. Catherine's form became clearer, more solid, and he realized with growing terror that she wasn't just a memory or residual haunting. She was a conscious spirit with an agenda, and she wasn't going to let him leave until that agenda was satisfied. "Confess," she demanded, pointing one rotting finger at Marcus's chest. "Confess what your family did to me, and I'll let you go. Keep the secret, and you'll join me here forever." Marcus looked into her eyes and saw not just anger, but decades of loneliness and pain. This woman had been denied justice for 70 years, her murder covered up by people who should have protected her. As much as he wanted to deny it, wanted to defend his family's honor, Marcus found himself believing every word she said. "I confess," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I confess that Thomas Webb murdered Catherine Morrison on this bridge in 1953, and that my family covered up his crime." The moment the words left his lips, Catherine's expression changed. The rage faded from her eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Her wedding dress became white again, clean and new, and the flowers in her hair bloomed fresh and fragrant. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was no longer the rasp of the grave but the sweet voice of a young woman in love. "I can rest now." She faded slowly, like morning mist touched by sunlight, until Marcus was alone on the bridge once more. The exits reappeared, and he found he could move again. He gathered his things and ran, not stopping until he reached his car, parked at the bridge's entrance. Marcus never told anyone about what he'd experienced that night, but he did start asking questions about his great-uncle Thomas. What he discovered in old newspaper archives and family records confirmed Catherine's story in every detail. Thomas Webb had indeed been engaged to Catherine Morrison in 1953. She had disappeared just days before their wedding, and Thomas had told everyone she'd gotten cold feet and run away to Cincinnati. Thomas had died in 1987, taking his secret to the grave, but the secret hadn't died with him. It had lived on in the spirit of his victim, waiting for someone from his family to finally acknowledge the truth. The covered bridge still stands on Old Mill Road, but locals say it feels different now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for decades. Some claim that on quiet nights you can hear wedding music drifting from its weathered walls, but it's no longer the twisted, angry melody that once haunted the structure. Now it sounds like a celebration, like a bride finally getting the wedding she was denied so long ago. Story 4. Robert Bobby Hutchins had been inspecting coal mines for the federal government for 18 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the underground could throw at him. Methane leaks, unstable ceiling supports, flooded shafts, equipment failures that could kill a man in seconds. But the Blackwater mine in Logan County, West Virginia, presented a different kind of challenge entirely. The mine had been closed for 3 months, following reports of unusual atmospheric disturbances that made equipment malfunction and caused several miners to refuse to enter certain sections. Bobby's job was to conduct a comprehensive safety inspection to determine whether the mine could be reopened or if it should be permanently sealed. What he found in the company files disturbed him more than any structural defect could have. The Blackwater mine had a history of accidents dating back to its opening in 1924, cave-ins, gas explosions, equipment failures that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. Most troubling was an incident from 1967 when a section of the mine had collapsed, trapping 14 miners for 6 days before rescue teams could reach them. All 14 had died, their bodies recovered only after weeks of dangerous excavation work. Bobby entered the mine at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, his equipment bag loaded with atmospheric monitors, structural assessment tools, and enough battery-powered lighting to illuminate a football field. The main shaft descended at a steep angle, its walls lined with timber supports that creaked ominously under the weight of millions of tons of earth above. The first few hours passed normally. Bobby documented support beam conditions, tested air quality, and made notes about areas where water seepage had caused structural deterioration. His equipment readings were all within normal parameters, and he began to wonder if the atmospheric disturbances were nothing more than nervous miners spooked by the mine's reputation. Then he reached Section 7, the area where the 1967 collapse had occurred. His atmospheric monitor immediately began registering impossible readings. The device showed methane levels that should have triggered explosive conditions, but Bobby could smell nothing unusual in the air. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly, showing simultaneous hot and cold spots that defied the laws of physics. Most disturbing, his electromagnetic field detector was picking up signals that seemed to pulse in regular patterns, almost like a heartbeat. Bobby had learned to trust his instruments over his senses, but everything his equipment was telling him contradicted what his eyes and nose reported. The air felt normal, even pleasant, with a slight coolness that provided relief from the stuffiness of the upper levels. But his monitors insisted he was standing in a death trap that should have killed him the moment he entered. As he tried to reconcile the contradictory readings, Bobby heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, faint but unmistakable, calling from somewhere deeper in the mine. They sounded distant and muffled, like people shouting through thick walls, but he could make out individual words. "Help us," came one voice, desperate and pleading. "We're trapped down here." Bobby's training kicked in immediately. Despite the closed status of the mine, someone might have entered illegally and gotten lost or injured. He grabbed his radio to call for backup, but found only static. The mine's depth and the surrounding rock made radio communication impossible. Following the voices deeper into Section 7, Bobby found himself in passages that didn't match his blueprints. The tunnels seemed to branch and twist in ways that made no geological sense, leading him through chambers that felt far too large for a coal mine operation. His flashlight beam revealed support timbers that looked much older than the mine's official construction date, some bearing carved initials and dates from the 1800s. The voices grew clearer as he advanced, and Bobby realized with growing horror that he could now make out specific words and phrases. The trapped miners were describing their situation in detail: where they were located, how long they'd been trapped, the rising water levels that threatened to drown them. "Day 6 down here," called one voice, thick with exhaustion and despair. "Water's up to our waists now. If somebody don't find us soon, we ain't gonna make it much longer." Bobby knew those words. He'd read them in the official report of the 1967 disaster, transcribed from recordings made by the trapped miners before their radio equipment had failed. These were the exact words spoken by men who had died over 50 years ago. Panic began to claw at Bobby's chest as he realized the impossible truth. He wasn't hearing living voices calling for help. He was hearing the echoes of men who had died in these tunnels decades before he was born, their final desperate hours playing out again and again like a recording stuck on repeat. Bobby tried to turn back, to retrace his steps to the main shaft, but the passages had changed around him. Tunnels he'd walked through minutes earlier now led to dead ends or opened into chambers filled with stagnant water. His carefully maintained mental map of the mine's layout had become useless in a place that seemed to reshape itself according to its own malevolent logic. "Who's there?" called a new voice closer than the others. "We can hear your footsteps. Are you with the rescue team?" Bobby's flashlight illuminated a figure stumbling toward him through the darkness, and he nearly screamed. The man approaching him wore mining clothes from another era, his face streaked with coal dust and desperation. But it was the man's eyes that confirmed Bobby's worst fears. They held the hollow, desperate look of someone who had been buried alive for days, someone who had felt hope drain away drop by drop, like water through limestone. "Thank God you found us," the figure said, reaching out with hands that Bobby could see through. "My name's Charlie Morrison. We've been trapped down here since the cave-in. How many of you are there? Can you get us out?" Bobby understood now why the mine's equipment had been malfunctioning, why miners had refused to enter certain sections. The Blackwater mine wasn't just haunted by the memories of its victims. It was actively reliving their tragedy, trapping anyone who ventured too deep into its cursed depths. "I'm here to help," Bobby heard himself say, though he wasn't sure why he said it. Something about Charlie Morrison's desperation compelled him to respond, to offer comfort even to a spirit who had been dead for decades. Charlie's translucent face lit up with hope. "We're in the back chamber, where the main support beam came down. There's 14 of us still alive, but Jimmy's hurt bad and the water keeps rising. You got rope? Digging equipment?" Bobby followed Charlie through passages that seemed to exist outside of normal space and time, past walls that wept with decades-old tears, through chambers where the sound of falling rock echoed endlessly. They reached a large cavern where 13 other miners waited, their faces showing various stages of hope, despair, and resignation. These were the 14 men who had died in 1967, still trapped in their final moments, still waiting for a rescue that would never come. They looked at Bobby with such desperate gratitude that he felt his heart breaking for them. "You're all dead," Bobby said gently, the words coming from some deep well of compassion he didn't know he possessed. "The cave-in happened 53 years ago. Your families mourned you. Your bodies were recovered and buried with honor." The miners looked at each other with growing understanding, and Bobby saw peace begin to replace the desperation in their eyes. Charlie Morrison nodded slowly, as if finally accepting a truth he'd been denying for over half a century. "We've been holding on so long," Charlie said, his voice fading like wind through autumn leaves. "Waiting for someone to find us, to tell us it was going to be okay. Reckon we can let go now." One by one, the 14 miners faded from view, their forms becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. As they departed, Bobby felt the mine around him change. The impossible passages straightened into recognizable tunnels, his equipment readings returned to normal, and he found himself back in Section 7 with a clear path to the main shaft. Bobby emerged from the Blackwater mine 8 hours after he'd entered, his official report documenting structural issues that would require extensive repairs before the mine could safely reopen. He never mentioned the voices or the ghostly miners in his written assessment, but he made sure to include a recommendation that Section 7 be permanently sealed. Years later, when the Blackwater mine was finally closed for good, workers found something in the sealed Section 7 that local newspapers described as a memorial chamber. 14 hard hats were arranged in a perfect circle around a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for helping us find our way home, the boys of 67. Bobby Hutchins never entered another coal mine after that day. He transferred to surface mining inspection, claiming he preferred working under open sky. But sometimes on quiet nights, he still heard Charlie Morrison's voice in his dreams, no longer desperate or afraid, but peaceful and grateful, saying, "Thank you," again and again, like a prayer finally answered. Story 5. Linda Patterson had been a visiting nurse for 8 years, but she'd never taken an assignment quite like the mountain clinic in Virginia's Blue Ridge. The regular nurse, Janet Morris, had disappeared without explanation 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind only a note saying she couldn't continue working there. The clinic served a remote community of families who lived so far from civilization that the nearest hospital was a 2-hour drive on winding mountain roads. The job paid exceptionally well for such a remote location, which should have been Linda's first warning sign. Good money usually meant dangerous conditions, difficult patients, or situations that drove away other medical professionals. But Linda needed the income, and she'd always prided herself on being able to handle whatever challenges rural medicine could present. The clinic occupied a converted cabin that clung to the mountainside like something that had grown there naturally. Built from local stone and weathered timber, it blended so seamlessly with the landscape that Linda almost missed it on her first drive up. Inside, she found medical equipment that was surprisingly modern and well-maintained, along with patient records that painted a picture of a healthy, stable community with typical rural health concerns. What struck Linda as odd was the way the local patients spoke about Dr. Morrison, the physician who had supposedly established the clinic. Every person she treated mentioned him with a reverence that bordered on worship, describing miraculous recoveries and treatments that seemed to defy medical explanation. "Dr. Morrison saved my boy when he had the fever that wouldn't break," said elderly Mrs. Caldwell, her eyes bright with gratitude. 3 days that child burned like fire, and then the doctor came with his special medicine, and by morning the fever was gone. Linda had reviewed the medical records and found no mention of any Dr. Morrison. According to the files, the clinic had been staffed entirely by visiting nurses since its establishment in 1995. When she asked patients to describe Dr. Morrison, their answers were remarkably consistent. A tall man with graying hair and gentle hands who always wore a black medical bag and arrived at all hours to help those in need. By her second day, Linda began to suspect that Dr. Morrison was either an unlicensed practitioner working illegally in the area or a local folk healer whose reputation had grown beyond his actual abilities. She decided to stay alert for any sign of this mysterious doctor, planning to report him to the appropriate authorities if he was indeed practicing medicine without proper credentials. On Friday evening, as Linda was closing the clinic for the weekend, she heard a knock at the door. Outside stood a middle-aged man she didn't recognize, his face etched with worry. "Please, nurse, you got to help me," he said, his voice thick with mountain accent. "It's my daughter Emma. She's burning up with fever, and nothing we do brings it down. Dr. Morrison always helps when the children get sick like this." Linda grabbed her medical bag and followed the man to his truck, mentally preparing to treat what sounded like a serious pediatric fever. During the bumpy ride to his cabin, she questioned him about Dr. Morrison, but his answers only deepened the mystery. "Been coming to these mountains for near on 50 years, the man said. "My daddy knew him, and his daddy before that. Always shows up when folks need help the most, never asks for payment except maybe a hot meal or a place to rest." The man's cabin was typical of the remote mountain homes Linda had visited, but his daughter's condition was anything but typical. 8-year-old Emma lay unconscious on her bed, her temperature registering 105 degrees on Linda's digital thermometer. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested severe systemic infection. Linda immediately began standard fever reduction protocols, but nothing she tried seemed to have any effect. Emma's temperature remained dangerously high, and her condition continued to deteriorate. Linda realized the child needed immediate hospitalization, but the nearest facility was hours away, and Emma might not survive the journey. As she worked frantically to stabilize her patient, Linda heard footsteps on the cabin's front porch. The door opened, and a tall man with graying hair entered, carrying a worn black medical bag that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Dr. Morrison," the father said with obvious relief. "Thank God you're here." The man nodded to Linda with professional courtesy. "Good evening, nurse. I see you're dealing with a difficult case." Linda studied his face, trying to place something that seemed familiar about his features. He had the kind of timeless quality that made it impossible to determine his exact age, and his clothes, while clean and professional, seemed to belong to an earlier era. "Are you licensed to practice in Virginia?" Linda asked, her professional training overriding her relief at having help. Dr. Morrison smiled sadly. "My license expired some time ago. But I've been treating folks in these mountains longer than you've been alive, nurse. Would you like my assistance with the child?" Despite her concerns about his credentials, Linda found herself nodding. Emma's condition was beyond anything she could handle alone, and this man radiated the kind of calm competence that comes from decades of medical experience. Dr. Morrison examined Emma with gentle thoroughness, his hands moving with practiced skill as he checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, and assessed her neurological responses. From his black bag, he produced medicines in bottles that bore no modern labels, their contents appearing to be herbal preparations rather than manufactured pharmaceuticals. "This is mountain fever," he said quietly. "It strikes children in these parts when the seasons change. Modern medicine calls it viral encephalitis, but the old treatments work better than anything from the pharmacy." He administered his mysterious medicines with precise dosages, explaining each step to Linda in terms that revealed extensive medical knowledge. Within minutes, Emma's breathing became deeper and more regular. Her temperature began to drop for the first time in days. As they worked together through the night, Linda found herself drawn into conversation with Dr. Morrison. He spoke about cases he'd treated, patients he'd saved, and the unique health challenges faced by mountain communities. His knowledge was encyclopedic, but something about his stories troubled Linda. He referenced medical practices and treatments that hadn't been used in decades, spoke about epidemics from the 1960s and 70s, as if he'd witnessed them personally. "How long have you been practicing medicine?" Linda asked as dawn light began filtering through the cabin windows. "Since 1952, Dr. Morrison replied without hesitation. Graduated from the University of Virginia Medical School and came to these mountains to set up practice. Been here ever since." Linda did quick mental math. If he'd graduated in 1952, Dr. Morrison would have to be in his 90s, possibly older. But the man sitting beside her appeared to be in his 50s at most, with the stamina and dexterity of someone far younger than his claimed age would suggest. Emma woke up just after sunrise, her fever completely broken, her eyes clear and bright. She smiled at her father and asked for breakfast, showing no signs of the severe illness that had nearly claimed her life hours earlier. It was, by any medical standard, a miraculous recovery. As Dr. Morrison packed his black bag, Linda noticed something that made her blood run cold. Among his antique medical instruments, she glimpsed a prescription pad with his name printed at the top. The paper was yellowed with age, and the printed address showed the same mountain clinic where she'd been working all week. "Doctor," Linda said carefully, "could you show me your medical license?" Dr. Morrison reached into his jacket and handed her a folded document. Linda opened it with trembling hands and found herself staring at a Virginia medical license issued to Dr. James Morrison in 1952. The photograph showed a young man who bore a striking resemblance to the doctor standing before her, but the license had expired decades ago. More disturbing still, there was a death certificate attached to the back of the license, dated 1973, stating that Dr. James Morrison had died in a car accident while making house calls during a winter storm. Linda looked up from the documents to find herself alone in the cabin. Dr. Morrison had vanished as silently as he'd arrived, leaving behind only the lingering scent of old-fashioned antiseptic and the sound of Emma's healthy laughter from the kitchen. Later that day, Linda drove to the county seat and spent hours in the courthouse records office, researching Dr. James Morrison. What she found confirmed her worst fears and explained everything she'd witnessed. Dr. Morrison had indeed established the Mountain Clinic in 1952, dedicating his life to serving the remote communities of the Blue Ridge. He died in 1973 while driving through a blizzard to reach a patient, his car sliding off an icy mountain road. But according to patient testimonies and local folklore, Dr. Morrison had never stopped making house calls. For 50 years after his death, he'd continued to appear whenever the mountain people needed medical help, bringing his old-fashioned remedies and gentle bedside manner to cases that modern medicine couldn't handle. Linda realized with growing horror that she might not be a visiting nurse covering for a missing colleague. She might be the ghost of a medical professional who had died serving these people, doomed to repeat her service for eternity without even realizing she was dead. That evening, Linda stood in the clinic's small bathroom, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror. Her face looked back at her, but something about it seemed insubstantial, like an image projected onto morning mist. She touched the glass, and her reflection touched back, but she felt no connection between her finger and the cool surface. Linda Patterson had died 3 weeks earlier in a car accident while driving to her first day at the Mountain Clinic. Janet Morris, the nurse she thought she was replacing, had fled after discovering the truth about the clinic's supernatural staff. Linda was now part of that staff, bound to serve the mountain people for as long as they needed medical care, working alongside Dr. Morrison in an endless cycle of healing that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The mountain people knew the truth, but they kept it to themselves. In a place where good medical care was hard to find, they weren't about to question the miracle of practitioners who served them faithfully, regardless of their mortality status. The dead made excellent doctors, they reasoned, because they had all eternity to perfect their craft. Story 6. Reverend Thomas Gray had been handling serpents in the name of the Lord for 23 years, and in all that time, he'd never been bitten, not once. The congregation of the Holiness Church of God's Power in eastern Kentucky saw this as proof of his righteousness, evidence that the Holy Spirit truly moved through him when he lifted those deadly creatures above his head in worship. Thomas took no pride in his immunity to snakebite. He knew that serpent handling wasn't about testing God's protection or proving one's faith through dangerous stunts. It was about surrendering completely to divine will, about becoming so filled with the Spirit that earthly concerns like venom and death simply ceased to matter. The practice traced back to Mark 16:18. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. Thomas's grandfather had been among the first serpent handlers in Kentucky, and the tradition had passed down through 3 generations of gray men who believed that handling poisonous snakes was a direct commandment from Jesus Christ. During the week of revival meetings in September, a stranger appeared at the church carrying a wooden box that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. The man introduced himself as Brother Samuel from Tennessee, claiming he'd heard about Reverend Gray's powerful ministry and wanted to contribute a special serpent to the service. The snake he revealed was unlike anything Thomas had ever encountered. It was a timber rattlesnake, certainly, but larger and more magnificently marked than any he'd seen in decades of handling. Its scales gleamed like polished obsidian, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. Most disturbing were the markings along its back, which formed patterns that resembled ancient symbols rather than natural coloration. "This here's a special serpent," Brother Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Been in my family for generations. It only comes out for the most righteous of men, the ones who got no sin hiding in their hearts." Thomas felt a chill of unease as he looked into the serpent's eyes. Every instinct told him there was something wrong with this creature, something that went beyond the natural danger of venomous snakes. But the congregation was watching, expecting him to demonstrate the same fearless faith he'd shown for over 2 decades. The first night of revival, Thomas incorporated the mysterious serpent into his service with his usual confidence. As he lifted the creature above his head, praising God and calling down the Holy Spirit, he noticed something troubling. The snake didn't behave like the others in his collection. Instead of remaining relatively passive in the grip of spiritual ecstasy, this serpent watched the congregation with calculating intelligence, its forked tongue tasting the air as if seeking something specific. During his sermon about spiritual purity and the cleansing power of faith, Thomas saw the serpent's behavior change dramatically. When he spoke about forgiveness and redemption, it remained calm. But whenever he mentioned sin or judgment, the creature became agitated, its rattles buzzing with an intensity that seemed to vibrate through the entire church building. After the service, Thomas approached Brother Samuel with questions about the serpent's origins, but found that the stranger had vanished without a trace. No one in the congregation had seen him leave, and his truck was gone from the church parking lot. All that remained was the wooden box and its supernatural occupant. The second night of revival brought the first sign of the serpent's true nature. As Thomas preached about the importance of confession and spiritual honesty, the snake fixed its gaze on Jimmy Peterson, a deacon who sat in the front pew with his wife and children. The creature's behavior became increasingly aggressive, its body coiling and uncoiling as if preparing to strike. When Thomas lifted the serpent during the climactic moment of his sermon, it did something unprecedented. It struck out toward Jimmy Peterson, not at Thomas, who was holding it. The movement was so sudden and deliberate that Thomas nearly lost his grip on the creature. "Brother Jimmy," Thomas called out, his voice carrying over the confused murmurs of the congregation. "This serpent seems to have taken notice of you. Is there something the Lord is trying to tell us?" Jimmy Peterson's face went pale as death. He stammered some excuse about feeling ill and fled the church with his family close behind. Later that evening, Thomas learned from other church members that Jimmy had been having an affair with a woman from the next county, betraying his wife of 15 years and violating every principle the church held sacred. The third night revealed the serpent's true purpose. As Thomas held the creature during his sermon about hidden sins and divine judgment, it focused its attention on different members of the congregation in turn. Each person it stared at with those unnaturally intelligent eyes would shift uncomfortably, sweat beginning to bead on their foreheads despite the cool autumn air. Mary Lou Jenkins, the church organist, suddenly stood up and confessed to stealing money from the collection plate to pay her gambling debts. Deacon Robert Hayes admitted to cheating on his taxes for the past 5 years. One by one, members of the congregation began confessing sins they'd kept hidden for years, as if the serpent's gaze compelled honesty from their guilty hearts. Thomas began to realize that this was no ordinary snake. It was some kind of supernatural judge, capable of sensing the hidden guilt that lived in human hearts. The creature only became aggressive when it detected moral corruption, and its presence seemed to strip away the pretenses and false righteousness that people used to hide their true nature. On the fourth night, Thomas made a terrible discovery. As he preached about the cleansing power of truth, the serpent's gaze turned toward him with the same calculating intelligence it had shown toward the confessing congregation members. For the first time in 23 years of serpent handling, Thomas felt genuine fear. The snake in his hands became agitated, its body tensing with the promise of violence. Its eyes locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to burn through his soul. And Thomas knew with horrible certainty that his own hidden sin had been discovered. 24 years earlier, before he'd found faith and been called to the ministry, Thomas Gray had been a different man. He'd been drinking heavily, struggling with anger and resentment that poisoned every relationship in his life. One night, in a rage fueled by alcohol and jealousy, he'd struck his first wife during an argument about money. Elizabeth had fallen badly, hitting her head on the corner of their kitchen table. Thomas had panicked, calling for an ambulance and claiming she'd fallen accidentally. Elizabeth had died on the way to the hospital, and the coroner had ruled her death accidental. Thomas had never told anyone the truth, not even in the confessional booth where he'd sought forgiveness for every other sin in his life. He'd buried that guilt so deeply that he'd almost convinced himself it really had been an accident. He'd devoted his life to God's service partly as penance for what he'd done, but he'd never found the courage to confess the truth aloud. Now standing before his congregation, with a supernatural serpent in his hands, Thomas felt that buried sin rising to the surface like poison drawn from a wound. The snake sensed his guilt, and its behavior made clear that it would not tolerate such hypocrisy from someone who claimed to be righteous. "This serpent," Thomas said, his voice trembling with the weight of 24 years of hidden shame, "this serpent knows the truth about all of us. It can see the sin we carry in our hearts, the guilt we think we've hidden from God." The congregation watched in tense silence as Thomas struggled with the creature, which had become increasingly aggressive. Its rattles filled the church with an ominous buzzing that seemed to echo from the very walls themselves. "I have sinned," Thomas confessed, tears streaming down his face. "I have sinned grievously, and I have hidden my sin for 24 years. I killed my first wife Elizabeth in a moment of drunken rage, and I have let everyone believe it was an accident." The moment the words left his lips, the serpent in his hands underwent a dramatic transformation. Its supernatural intelligence faded from its eyes, and it became just another timber rattlesnake, docile and manageable in the grip of genuine spiritual confession. But Thomas's confession came too late to save him from the consequences of his deception. The serpent, having served its purpose as an agent of divine judgment, delivered a single fatal bite to his wrist before becoming passive once again. Thomas Gray died that night in the church he'd served for over 2 decades, surrounded by a congregation that finally understood the true nature of faith and confession. The mysterious serpent was never seen again, though some said Brother Samuel returned in the night to reclaim his supernatural creature. The Holiness Church of God's Power continued to practice serpent handling, but they never again encountered a snake with the power to judge human souls. They learned to see Thomas Gray's death not as divine punishment, but as the final act of a man who chose truth over self-preservation, even when that truth cost him everything. The church members who had witnessed the serpent's supernatural behavior kept the story to themselves, understanding that some manifestations of divine justice are too terrible and too sacred to share with the outside world. They continued to handle serpents in their worship, but they did so with a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to surrender completely to God's will, knowing that divine judgment could arrive in forms they never expected. Story 7. Eddie Chen had been unemployed for 6 months when his grandfather told him about the ginseng growing wild in the North Carolina mountains. The furniture factory where he'd worked since high school had closed down, taking most of the decent-paying jobs in his small town with it. With bills piling up and his savings nearly exhausted, Eddie was desperate enough to try anything, even tramping through the woods looking for roots that might be worth a few $100s. His grandfather had been one of the last traditional ginseng hunters in the region, part of a generation that knew how to read the forest signs and find the elusive plants that grew in the shadows of ancient oak and maple trees. Before he died, the old man had marked several promising locations on a hand-drawn map, areas where he'd found good ginseng in years past, but had never fully harvested. The map led Eddie deep into the Nantahala National Forest, to places where tourist trails gave way to animal paths, and the only sounds were wind through leaves and the distant call of mountain birds. Eddie had grown up hiking these mountains, but he'd never ventured quite this far from marked trails, never spent days alone in wilderness where cell phone signals died and GPS devices became useless. According to his grandfather's notes, the best ginseng grew in what the Cherokee had called sacred groves, places where the spiritual energy of the land was particularly strong. Eddie had always dismissed such talk as old-world superstition, but as he hiked deeper into the forest, he began to sense something different about these particular woods. The trees here seemed older, larger, and more densely packed than in other parts of the mountains. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in strange patterns that created shifting geometric designs on the forest floor. Most noticeable was the silence, a profound quiet that seemed to muffle even his own footsteps and breathing. On his second day of searching, Eddie found his first ginseng plant exactly where his grandfather's map indicated it should be. The root was magnificent, easily 40 years old, based on its size and the number of growth rings on its stem. But what struck Eddie as unusual was its placement. The ginseng grew at the center of a perfect circle of smaller plants, all arranged with a symmetry that seemed too deliberate to be natural. As he carefully dug around the valuable root, Eddie noticed other strange formations throughout the grove. Stones had been arranged in patterns that resembled the medicine wheels he'd seen in books about Native American culture. Ancient trees bore carved symbols that had been worn smooth by decades of weather, but remained clearly visible to anyone who knew how to look. Eddie's excitement over his first significant find overcame any unease about the strange formations. Wild ginseng of this quality could bring several $100s from the right buyer, enough to keep him afloat for another month while he searched for steady employment. He carefully harvested the root, following his grandfather's teachings about sustainable collection, and leaving the smaller plants to mature. The second day brought an even more remarkable discovery. Eddie found an entire grove where ginseng plants grew in perfect geometric patterns, each one positioned with mathematical precision in relation to its neighbors. The roots he harvested here were the finest he'd ever seen, some weighing over a pound each, and showing the gnarled, human-like shape that collectors prized most highly. But as Eddie worked to harvest these valuable plants, he began to notice disturbing signs that he wasn't alone in the forest. Footprints appeared in the soft earth around the ginseng patches, but they were unlike any boot prints he'd ever seen. They seemed to be made by feet that were broader and longer than normal human proportions, with what appeared to be claw marks extending from the toes. More troubling were the stone markers that seemed to appear overnight. Eddie would clear an area of debris in the evening, only to find carefully arranged stone cairns there the next morning. The stones were always placed in specific patterns that seemed to carry meaning, though Eddie couldn't decipher what message they might convey. On the third morning, Eddie woke to find his campsite surrounded by a ring of carved wooden stakes, each one topped with symbols that resembled the Cherokee writing he'd seen in museums. The stakes hadn't been there when he'd gone to sleep, and their placement created a perfect circle around his tent with mathematical precision that no human could have achieved in darkness. Fear began to override Eddie's excitement about his valuable harvest. He'd heard stories about protected Cherokee burial grounds and sacred sites that were off-limits to outsiders, places where disturbing the natural order could bring serious consequences. His grandfather had always spoken respectfully about the Cherokee who had once inhabited these mountains, warning that some places in the forest were not meant for casual visitors. As Eddie packed his gear to leave, he made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. Among the ginseng roots in his collection bag, he found carved bone artifacts that he certainly hadn't put there. The bones were carved with intricate symbols and seemed very old, their surfaces worn smooth by handling. They appeared to be ritual objects of some kind, possibly burial goods that belonged in a Cherokee grave. Eddie tried to leave the forest, following the trail markers he'd used to navigate deeper into the wilderness, but found that the familiar paths had changed overnight. Trees he remembered as landmarks appeared in different locations, and the creek he'd been following seemed to flow in the opposite direction. His compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, and his GPS device showed only error messages. As the day wore on, Eddie realized with growing terror that he was completely lost in a forest that seemed to be actively working against his escape. The trails led in circles, bringing him back to the same ginseng groves again and again, despite his efforts to travel in straight lines away from them. That evening, as Eddie made camp in what he hoped was a different location, he heard sounds that made his blood run cold. Drums echoed through the forest, their rhythm steady and hypnotic, accompanied by voices chanting in a language he didn't recognize. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, creating an acoustic environment that disoriented and frightened him. Around midnight, Eddie saw lights moving through the trees, not the steady beam of flashlights, but dancing flames that flickered and wavered like torches. The lights moved in procession through the forest, accompanied by the continuing drumbeat and chanting voices that grew closer with each passing hour. Eddie hid in his tent, afraid to look outside but unable to block out the sounds of what appeared to be a ceremony taking place in the forest around him. The chanting rose and fell in complex harmonies, and he could hear the crackling of large fires and the shuffling of many feet through fallen leaves. When dawn finally broke, Eddie emerged from his tent to find that his campsite had been transformed. The ground around his tent was covered with elaborate sand paintings created from colored earth, depicting animals and spirits in traditional Cherokee artistic style. The paintings were so detailed and beautiful that Eddie knew they must have taken hours to create. At the center of the largest sand painting lay a message written in English, formed from small white stones. "Return what was taken from the sacred place, and the path home will be revealed." Eddie understood immediately what was being asked of him. The ginseng he'd harvested didn't just grow in random forest locations. It grew in Cherokee burial grounds and sacred sites, places where it had been planted by ancestors as part of spiritual ceremonies. By taking the roots, he'd been robbing graves and desecrating holy ground. With shaking hands, Eddie removed all the ginseng roots from his collection bag and arranged them carefully in the patterns where he'd found them. He also placed the carved bone artifacts he'd discovered among his gear, at what appeared to be the center of the sacred grove, understanding that they belonged to Cherokee ancestors who were buried there. As he completed the task of returning what he'd taken, Eddie felt the oppressive atmosphere of the forest begin to lift. The drums and chanting faded away, and the confusing maze of trails resolved itself into clear paths that led toward familiar landmarks. Eddie made his way out of the forest that afternoon, following trails that now led directly toward the parking area where he'd left his truck 3 days earlier. He never returned to hunt ginseng in those particular mountains, and he never spoke publicly about what he'd experienced in the Cherokee sacred grove. But Eddie learned something valuable from his encounter with the guardian spirits of the forest. Some things in the natural world are not meant to be harvested or possessed by outsiders. The ginseng growing in those sacred groves served purposes far more important than his immediate financial needs, and the Cherokee ancestors who protected those places had every right to defend what belonged to them. Years later, when Eddie finally found steady employment and his financial situation improved, he began volunteering with organizations that worked to protect Cherokee cultural sites and sacred places throughout the Appalachian Mountains. He never mentioned his personal experience in the forest, but his dedication to preservation work spoke to his deep understanding of why some places needed to remain undisturbed. The Cherokee burial grounds and sacred groves continue to be protected by forces that most people never encounter. But those who venture too far into forbidden territory and take what doesn't belong to them learn quickly that the ancestors are still watching, still guarding the places they held sacred in life. Story 8. Emily Rodriguez had built her antiques business on finding forgotten treasures in abandoned places, but the coal company town of Millfield, West Virginia, presented an opportunity unlike anything she'd encountered before. The entire town had been abandoned in 1987 when the mine closed, leaving behind a perfectly preserved snapshot of Appalachian industrial life from the early 20th century. According to her research, Millfield had been a classic company town, where the coal corporation owned everything from the houses where miners lived to the store where they bought their groceries. The miners were paid in company scrip rather than real money, creating a closed economic system that kept workers perpetually in debt to their employers. Emily's contact in Charleston had assured her that the property was legally accessible, the current owners happy to have someone remove valuable items before the buildings were demolished for safety reasons. The drive to Millfield took her through increasingly remote mountain roads until she reached a collection of weathered buildings that clung to the hillside like barnacles on a sinking ship. The company store dominated the town center, a 3-story brick building that had once served as the economic heart of the community. Its large windows were intact, but covered with decades of grime, and hand-painted signs advertising long-defunct products still hung above the entrance. Emily could practically smell the profit potential emanating from the building's dusty interior. Inside, she found exactly what she'd hoped for. Shelves lined with vintage merchandise that had apparently been abandoned when the store closed. Patent medicines in glass bottles, tools with wooden handles worn smooth by generations of use, bolts of fabric that had somehow survived decades without significant deterioration. Everything was covered with dust, but remarkably well preserved, as if time had simply stopped moving forward in 1987. What struck Emily as odd was the condition of the store's ledger books, which lay open on the counter as if someone had been working on them recently. The pages were filled with entries in multiple handwritings, recording purchases and payments that spanned decades of operation. But some of the entries appeared to be much more recent, written in fresh ink that couldn't possibly have been there for 35 years. Emily began loading her truck with the most valuable items she could identify. a collection of mining tools, several pieces of Depression-era glassware, and a set of account books that would interest collectors of industrial history. As she worked, she found herself drawn into the rhythms of the place, almost able to hear the echoes of conversations between storekeepers and customers who had conducted business here generations ago. The strangest discovery came when she found a credit application form lying on the counter, filled out in her own handwriting. According to the document, Emily Rodriguez had applied for a line of credit at the Millfield Company store, listing her address and employment information with perfect accuracy. The application was dated that very day, though Emily had no memory of filling out any paperwork. More unsettling were the receipts she found scattered around the store, apparently documenting purchases she'd made during her visit. The receipts listed items she'd selected for her truck, but they also included purchases she hadn't made. Groceries, clothing, household items, all charged to an account in her name that she certainly hadn't opened. As Emily examined these impossible documents, she heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floors above her. Someone was walking around in the upper levels of the store, their movements creating a steady rhythm of creaking boards and settling timbers. When she called out to identify herself, the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the abandoned building. Emily climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, which had apparently served as storage space for bulk merchandise. Here she found shelves lined with goods that defied explanation. Canned foods with expiration dates from the 1920s that appeared fresh and unspoiled, bolts of fabric that seemed to shift color and pattern when she wasn't looking directly at them, and tools that radiated an unnatural warmth despite the building's chill. The third floor revealed the store's most disturbing secret. This level had been converted into living quarters, apparently for store employees who couldn't afford to live elsewhere in the company town. But the rooms were still occupied, filled with personal belongings that suggested recent habitation despite the building's abandoned status. In one room, Emily found a family's worth of possessions: children's toys, women's clothing, men's work boots caked with coal dust that still seemed fresh. Photographs on the dresser showed a mining family from what appeared to be the 1940s, but the images had an unsettling quality that made Emily's skin crawl. The people in the photos seemed to be looking directly at her, their eyes tracking her movement around the room. The final room contained something that made Emily's blood turn to ice. It was set up as an office, with ledger books spread across a desk and an old adding machine that hummed with electrical power despite the building's lack of electricity. The ledgers were filled with current entries, documenting recent transactions and account balances for customers who had supposedly been dead for decades. Emily's name appeared throughout the most recent entries, along with a running tally of debt that seemed to grow larger with each item she'd loaded into her truck. According to the ledger, she now owed the Millfield Company store over $3,000 for merchandise she'd taken, plus interest calculated at rates that seemed designed to ensure the debt could never be fully repaid. As Emily tried to make sense of the impossible bookkeeping, she heard voices coming from the store's main floor. Customers were apparently conducting business below, their conversations mixing with the familiar sounds of a functioning retail establishment. Cash registers chimed, floorboards creaked under the weight of shoppers, and she could hear the store clerk discussing prices and credit terms with people who spoke in the distinctive accent of mountain coal miners. Emily descended the stairs to find the store transformed. The dusty, abandoned interior had been replaced by a bustling commercial establishment that appeared to be operating exactly as it had during the town's heyday. Customers moved through the aisles, selecting merchandise and conducting business with a store clerk who looked up from his ledger books and smiled at Emily with genuine warmth. "Miss Rodriguez," the clerk said, consulting his records. "I see you've been making some significant purchases today. Your account balance is getting quite substantial. Will you be making a payment, or shall we add today's charges to your existing credit line?" Emily looked around the store and realized with growing horror that the customers browsing the merchandise were the same people she'd seen in the photographs upstairs, miners and their families from the 1940s and 50s, still shopping at the company store decades after their deaths, still trapped in the economic system that had bound them to this place during their lifetimes. "I didn't open an account here," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This store has been closed for 35 years. The clerk laughed good-naturedly. "Oh, miss, Once you take merchandise from the Millfield Company store, you automatically establish credit with us. It's been our policy since 1923, and our credit terms are very generous. We allow customers to work off their debts through service to the company. Emily understood now why the store had remained so well preserved, why the merchandise appeared fresh despite decades of abandonment. The Millfield Company store had never really closed. It continued to operate in some supernatural dimension, serving customers who had been economically bound to the company during their lifetimes and remained bound to it after death. The debt she'd incurred by taking antiques from the store had made her part of that system, trapped in an economic arrangement that transcended death itself. The company store collected souls as payment for debts that could never be fully satisfied, adding spiritual bondage to the financial exploitation that had characterized these mining towns during their operational years. Emily tried to leave, but found the store's doors had vanished, replaced by solid walls that offered no escape. The other customers watched her with expressions that mixed sympathy with resignation, understanding that she was about to join their ranks as a permanent resident of the company town. "Don't worry, miss," the clerk said, making notations in his ledger. "We'll find plenty of work for you here. The company always needs dedicated employees, and we offer very competitive terms. Room and board are provided, of course, though those expenses will be added to your account balance." Emily realized she was trapped in the same economic cycle that had enslaved generations of mountain families, bound to the company store by debt that would never be forgiven. She would spend eternity working to pay off charges that accumulated faster than she could satisfy them, serving customers who were themselves trapped in the same supernatural economic system. The last entry in the store's ledger, written in Emily's own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it, read, "Emily Rodriguez, account opened October 31st, permanent employee status, debt to be satisfied through eternal service to the Millfield Company store." Outside the store, Emily's truck sat empty in the abandoned town center, its cargo mysteriously returned to the shelves where she'd found it. Visitors to Millfield sometimes reported seeing lights in the company store windows and hearing sounds of commercial activity, but no one was ever brave enough to investigate too closely. The company store continues to operate, serving a community of customers and employees who discovered too late that some debts follow you beyond the grave, and some economic systems are designed to never let their participants truly escape. Story 9. Michael Turner had been driving long-haul routes through the Appalachian Mountains for 15 years, and he thought he knew every shortcut between Virginia and Tennessee. When the Weather Service issued severe storm warnings for Interstate 81, Michael decided to take the old mountain highway that wound through the remote passes between the two states. It would add an hour to his delivery time, but it was better than sitting in a truck stop waiting for the storm to pass. The route he chose had once been a major thoroughfare, back in the days when bootleggers used it to transport illegal liquor from mountain stills to thirsty customers in distant cities. Local folklore claimed that some of the most notorious rum runners in Appalachian history had died on this road, their cars going off cliffs during high-speed chases with federal agents. But Michael didn't put much stock in ghost stories, and he needed to get his load of automotive parts to Knoxville before the deadline. The storm hit harder than the Weather Service had predicted, turning the mountain road into a treacherous ribbon of rain-slicked asphalt that twisted through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow his headlight beams. Michael slowed his big rig to a crawl, following the yellow center line like a lifeline through conditions that made visibility nearly impossible. Around midnight, as Michael navigated a particularly sharp curve, his headlights illuminated a figure standing beside the road with his thumb extended. The hitchhiker appeared to be a young man in his 20s, wearing clothes that looked oddly formal for someone walking along a mountain highway in the middle of a storm. Despite every rule of trucking safety that warned against picking up strangers, something about the hitchhiker's situation tugged at Michael's conscience. Michael pulled over and rolled down his passenger window. The young man climbed into the cab with obvious relief, shaking rain from his jacket and thanking Michael profusely for stopping. "Name's Johnny Caldwell," the hitchhiker said, extending a hand that felt unnaturally cold. "I appreciate the ride more than you know. Been walking for what feels like hours." Michael noticed immediately that Johnny's clothes weren't wet, despite the torrential rain outside. His jacket and pants appeared completely dry, and there was no sign that he'd been walking through the storm. But Michael attributed this to the poor lighting in the cab and his own fatigue after driving for 10 hours straight. "Where are you headed?" Michael asked, pulling back onto the road. "Wherever this road takes me," Johnny replied with a smile that seemed oddly knowing. "I've been traveling this route for a long time now, know it better than most folks who live around here." As they drove through the storm, Johnny proved to be an engaging conversationalist. He told stories about the mountain communities they passed, sharing details about local history and folklore that revealed an encyclopedic knowledge of the region. He spoke about bootlegging operations from the Prohibition era with the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from personal experience rather than book learning. "My granddaddy used to run shine on this very road," Johnny said, pointing toward a side path that branched off into the darkness. "Had a 1940 Ford that could outrun anything the feds could put on the mountain. Made this run twice a week for near on 10 years without getting caught." Michael found Johnny's stories fascinating, but something about his passenger troubled him in ways he couldn't quite identify. Johnny seemed to know things about the road that didn't match what Michael could see outside his windshield. He would point out landmarks and reference road signs that Michael's headlights never illuminated, as if Johnny could see things that remained invisible to everyone else. More disturbing were the directions Johnny occasionally offered. "Take the left fork up ahead," he'd say, "or watch out for that sharp drop-off coming up." But when Michael looked for these features, he found only the same winding two-lane highway he'd been following for hours. There were no forks in the road, no drop-offs, just the endless curves that characterized mountain driving. Around 2 a.m., Michael realized with growing unease that he'd been driving the same stretch of road for far longer than should have been possible. According to his odometer, he'd traveled over 100 miles since picking up Johnny, but the landscape outside remained unchanged. The same rock formations appeared again and again in his headlights, and he passed the same abandoned gas station at least 3 times. "Johnny," Michael said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice, "how long have you been hitchhiking on this road?" Johnny turned toward him with that strange, knowing smile. "Oh, I'd say about 47 years now. Ever since that night in 1976, when I took this curve too fast and went over the guardrail." Michael's blood turned to ice as Johnny's meaning became clear. He stole a glance at his passenger and saw that Johnny's appearance had changed subtly. His clothes, which had seemed merely old-fashioned before, now appeared to be genuine 1970s vintage. More disturbing, Johnny's skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and Michael could see through him to the passenger door beyond. "You're dead," Michael whispered, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Been dead for 47 years, Johnny confirmed cheerfully. "Died right here on this road when I was running a load of moonshine down to Bristol. Took that curve by Miller's Rock doing about 90 miles an hour in a rainstorm just like this one. Car went right through the guardrail and down the mountain. Took them 3 days to find my body." Michael tried to focus on the road ahead, but everything outside his windshield had become surreal and dreamlike. The yellow center line seemed to glow with its own light, and the guardrails appeared and disappeared like mirages. He realized with growing terror that he was no longer driving on a normal mountain highway, but trapped in some supernatural loop that existed outside normal space and time. "The thing about dying on this road," Johnny continued conversationally, "is that you don't always realize it happened, especially when you die sudden-like in an accident. Sometimes folks just keep driving, thinking they're trying to get somewhere, not understanding that they already arrived at their final destination." Michael checked his mirrors and saw nothing but darkness behind him, as if his truck were traveling through a void rather than along a mountain road. When he looked at his instrument panel, the gauges showed impossible readings. His speedometer registered 0 while his engine raced, his fuel gauge fluctuated wildly between empty and full, and his GPS displayed error messages in languages he didn't recognize. "How long have I been driving with you?" Michael asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. "That depends on how you count time," Johnny replied. "Could be a few hours, could be a few years. Time works different when you're traveling the bootlegger's road. Some folks drive this route for decades before they understand what happened to them." Michael remembered now the patch of black ice he'd hit about an hour before, picking up Johnny. the moment when his truck had skidded sideways toward the guardrail. He remembered the sickening sensation of his trailer jackknifing, the sound of metal scraping against stone, the brief moment of weightlessness before everything went dark. "I died in that accident," Michael said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I went over the side, didn't I?" Johnny nodded sympathetically. "Happens to a lot of folks on this road. Mountain driving can be treacherous, especially in weather like this. But the good news is you don't have to be alone. There's plenty of us who travel this route and we look out for each other." Through his windshield, Michael began to see other vehicles on the road. Cars and trucks from different eras, their drivers all heading in the same direction through the endless storm. A 1940 Ford that must have belonged to Johnny's grandfather, a convoy of 1950s pickup trucks loaded with mason jars, modern vehicles like his own that had joined the ghostly parade more recently. Michael understood now that the Bootleggers' Road had become a gathering place for those who died while traveling through these mountains, a supernatural highway where the spirits of accident victims continued their journeys for eternity. The road existed in a space between life and death, offering a kind of purgatory for souls who weren't ready to accept their fate. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "Now you drive," Johnny said simply, "same as the rest of us. Drive until you're ready to let go, until you can accept what happened and move on to whatever comes next. Some folks figure it out quick, others take decades. No rush though, we got all the time in the world." Michael looked ahead at the endless curve of road stretching into darkness and made his choice. He could continue driving this supernatural highway for years, decades, perhaps centuries, refusing to accept the reality of his death. Or he could acknowledge the truth and find peace in whatever lay beyond. He pulled his truck to the side of the road and turned off the engine. As he did, the storm began to clear, and Michael could see sunlight breaking through the clouds for the first time since the accident. The other vehicles on the Bootleggers' Road faded from view, and Johnny smiled at him with genuine warmth. "Good choice," Johnny said, his own form beginning to fade. "Most folks take a lot longer to figure it out. You must have people waiting for you on the other side." Michael thought of his wife and children, probably just now learning about the accident, probably wondering what had happened to him on that dark mountain road. He was ready to go to them, ready to leave the Bootleggers' Road behind, and continue his journey to whatever destination awaited him beyond death. The truck, the road, and Johnny Caldwell all dissolved into light, and Michael Turner finally completed his last delivery, arriving safely at a place where storms never came and no one ever had to drive alone through the darkness again. These 9 legends from Appalachia's forgotten corners remind us that the mountains hold secrets older than the coal seams beneath them. From ancient Cherokee spirits to trapped souls of miners, these stories echo through hollows, where the past refuses to stay buried. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of mountain darkness. Thank you for watching Sir Ravenclaw.